Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory. Wait a minute. Actually, I'm going to restart because we're not talking about games. Hello and welcome to Authors Die Twice, normally a podcast on video games and aesthetic theory hosted by two living failures. The living failures are still here, but today we are inaugurating a new sub-series side quest where we just talk about some random bullshit. So today, for our first foray into side content, we'll be discussing the painter Cy Twombly. I was going to give some biographical details or context, but I actually forget them slash don't know them. So we're going to need our guest to fill us in. Joining us to discuss Cy Twombly is Luke Barnhart. Luke is how should I introduce you here? A novelist, a literary scholar, and a
No,
painter.
don't say novelist. It's terrible.
Luke, it's great to have you on, and we're really excited to chat.
Thanks for having me. This is my very first podcast appearance ever.
Why don't we just jump right in? Again, like I was going to introduce Cy Twombly, but I don't know anything about him other than that he lived in Italy for a lot of his life and died in 2011. I feel like we can just kind of feel our way towards some basic context and understanding of him and his work, again, with your help. But just to start with, the basics. I thought we'd ask, what your own personal history is with Cy Twombly and particularly, as a painter, how if he is an influence on you or has some special significance.
Yeah, well, we have a shared history with Cy Twombly. I think maybe I knew his name or something like that the first time you took me to the PMA, the Philadelphia Museum of Art. What year would that have been? That would have been like,
I want to say it was 2015.
yeah, something around there. And I've always liked going to museums and like looking at paintings and stuff, but I feel that it's like extremely rare for me to have a sort of like emotional reaction to paintings. And that was like one of the few times in my life, the 50 Days at Ilium series where I like actually like felt like a little overwhelmed, almost like in an emotional way by the paintings. Like I just felt like I'd never really seen anything quite like it at the time.
I mean, I'll just say, Luke, I think you already know this, but um my foundational experience with Cy Twombly did come locally through 50 Days at Ilium at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is where I'm from Philadelphia, from the city, and went to school outside of Philadelphia, went to college. Um, and I ventured down there one day by myself, just to look around. This is back when I used to go to museums. I'm now just a total vulgarian and hate museums. Like you have to like drag me kicking and screaming to go to a museum. But this particular room in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I mean, it's an entire it is like a show-stopping room. I remember it being sort of brightly lit, which is important. Maybe we can talk about lighting and presentation later. But it's a sequence of a bunch of canvases. I think it's like eight, maybe. I don't have the precise
That
number. I can
sounds that
find it.
sounds right. I think there's like two on the back wall, two or three on the back wall, and two or three on each of the side walls.
Yeah, I just looked it up. It's 10. And that includes one, the Shield of Achilles, which is maybe my favorite of this series. That I think in the PMA is outside of the room. Actually, it's kind of like in the entryway. Um, but this is an adaptation of sorts, or a riff, on or reflection on Homer's Iliad. I was studying classics at the time, so I think I was predisposed toward being interested in it, but I find many adaptations stupid, so this is like a case where it really hit me on some deep level. Um uh Activating something, I think it was activated by my basic interest or familiarity with the topic, but totally transcended that. And to this day, like it's the single time I think in all my years of reluctantly going to art museums that I had an emotional response to a canvas or to a series of canvases. I was completely blown away. It was like an out of body ecstatic experience, honestly, which sounds or corny, but it was real, and as we talk, it would be interesting to sort of go over what about Twombly's work and Twombly's canvases maybe sparks that kind of reaction or inspires that kind of reaction. Particularly because when you Google his work now, especially for listeners who aren't familiar with it, he is like the epitome of that modern artist who looks like he's just scribbling on canvas. And uh, I actually think when I was very young, when my parents took me again reluctantly to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, I was totally confounded by his paintings because I thought they were just like child scribbling. Um,
That's the
and
same reaction that Joe Rogan had.
yeah, exactly, exactly. Uh, and we could talk about that too, because I think there is some truth in that kind of reaction, like there's something actually interesting about it. It's not just this vulgar thing that we're supposed to repress or forget from our childhood.
Mm,
But I do think like it's important to emphasize now for listeners that Twombly's canvases look really different in person. And to me, they have this just incredible luminosity and beauty, just like a sublime beauty, not like
mm,
something that has to be thought through or sort of intellected. You don't have to
mm,
like cogitate in front of a canvas and be like, I see the ideas here, I interpret this, and this is, and therefore I find it interesting or beautiful. They have this kind of pure sensory beauty to me that is prior to any of that. And that makes them actually very immediate, like makes them very easy to enjoy on an immediate
mm,
sensory level. And that I think sometimes or often has to do with the way that they're presented with their titanic or often titanic size,
mm,
um, the light streaming into the rooms where they're exhibited, um, and and with like the way the canvas itself, I think, reflects light, and the canvas itself becomes luminous because the canvases
mm,
contain so much white space.
mm.
So maybe I'll start there. Like here, I'll start there with a question, which is that Luke, you sent us this really awesome essay by Roland Barthes on Cy Twombly that I hadn't read, despite being a real Barthes head. And Bart talks about how in Twombly's work you can like feel the Mediterranean coast. The
Uh,
Mediterranean coast that's being gestured toward in the references to Homer, to Virgil, but also the Mediterranean coast where Twombly himself lived and presumably composed many of these canvases, or painted, I guess. Um, and and I want to say for me, like I totally have that feeling. They're full of light and air. And I wonder if that is partly just a function, of the whiteness of these canvases and of the museum exhibition space that they sort of project, right, and anticipate, and in which they're, of course, now invariably going to be shown.
I feel that it's kind of like I don't know why I have the stupidest response in my head to that question, which is like, why does this like Twombly painting that where he's just like written the word Virgil make me think of Virgil? Like, I feel like Bart talks about that too, like how the way like the names, in a way, it's like hilarious to just like write Virgil on like a canvas and then call that like your paint, like call that your painting, like not a quote from Virgil, not like a line of like poetry or anything, but just like write Virgil. I forget what exactly Bart says about that, but I mean, he says something essentially about the way like it both like conjures a world. Yeah, I don't know. There's something about the paintings like conjuring a world that are like simultaneously like when he writes Virgil, like of course it makes you think of Virgil and it makes you think of like the classical world, which he was obviously so obsessed with. But it also makes you think about like it conjures the world of like being obsessed with Virgil or like having to learn Virgil in school or like the chalkboard where like the professor has like written a quote from the Aeneid or something. I don't know. It's like they both yeah, I don't know how to answer that question. I feel like it could be the same thing with the Mediterranean where it's like yeah, I don't know if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of my favorite moments in the Bart essay where he says that what Twombly's classical references are gesturing toward is not so much the ancient Greek world as the more modern world where school children were forced to learn about Greek myth and
Mm,
heroes and practice, study Latin and Greek.
mm,
That is to say, Twombly's real referent is tradition,
mm,
rather than some ancient mythic past.
yeah.
And I would say for maybe this is part of what um, attracted me to his work early on is I guess maybe it sounds like sort of I don't know like problematic or just really basic and lame, but I like the place of tradition in his work. I
Mm,
like that he is dead serious or seems to be dead serious and uh I think self like intentionally sort of what's the word like sublime and monumental and
mm,
in dialogue with this larger yeah tradition of modernist classicism, and just modern classicism. Even though it's just like scribbles, like there's a version of Cy Twombly or a parody where it's like done in like neon colors and is sort of jokey or quote unquote subversive,
mm,
or quote unquote like provocative. And I
mm,
think the beauty of Cy Twombly is that he's not provocative. I'm saying this
mm,
is a total naive, as someone who has no sense of his place in art history or who knows not that much about the history of Western art. Like, I don't get the sense that he's putting it on or grinning or being like, look what I can get away with, right? Like he's like seems to be very seriously painting these canvases with a kind of rigor and a kind of like aestheticism
mm,
um, that is totally genuine and sincere. And I find that to be much more, I don't know, emotionally affecting, sort of like sensorily stimulating than if these were like some kind of like pop art or something, or experiments in anti-art.
Yeah, well, I just want to jump in because I think first of all, like I can't recall ever seeing a Twombly in person. It's entirely possible that I have and just like wasn't aware of it because I have been to museums, in different places a bunch of times throughout my life, but not recently and not that I would have necessarily been aware of Twombly. So I do want to return at some point to this question of like the presence of the work being the thing that gives you that kind of effect, which does seem pretty unique. And even in the conversation I had with Peter Schwenger, he talks about sitting in tears in front of one of Twombly's works as well. So this doesn't seem to be, a one-off thing. It seems to be like part of what makes his work great. But just touching on, because I have in Schwenger's book, there's a reproduction of Virgil, and just looking at it right now, I think it's kind of obvious, but also pretty important to note that it's the word Virgil, but each letter has like different states of erasure. So it's
mm,
also not just the word Virgil written on a canvas, and I think that's part of the rigor, Nathan, that you're talking about, is that it's a really particular kind of effacement of that word, which I mean, associatively with the sublime, I always think of ruins too, like ruins can
mm,
be sublime. So there is this monumental thing, but there's also a kind of doubleness of it, where it's partly fragmentary. It feels maybe at once like the complete or like too complete or too overwhelming thing of sublimity, but also at the same time, something that could just be iterated upon endlessly, which is kind of how his work seems to me, from an outsider's view. And I also wonder too, because from what I understand, I was listening to a talk that somebody gave about his work earlier, and it seemed what I gathered was that his earlier work was a lot more about decomposition. So he would do these like earlier paintings and just kind of let them, I don't know, let them decay or something like that. And then he eventually kind of moved into a different style. And Virgil's from, the 70s, which was when he had moved out of that period. But I wonder if there's kind of still a gesture toward that with language rather than with like the whole piece, since like each letter is kind of almost looks like it's been like whited out a little bit or something like that.
It kind of reminds me of my one, I think maybe my personal favorite moment of the Bart essay, which is the brief aside when he asks, "What is the essence of a pair of pants?" I just keep thinking about that like little aside in the essay where he's like, what is like he poses it very seriously, like what's the essence of a pair of pants? It's not like when they're crisply folded at the store and like perfectly like white. It's like when they're I think his example, which is also hilarious, is like the essence of a pair of pants is after like a young boy has like taken them off and thrown them on the floor. And they're lying in a crumple, and then he has that line which I find very, I don't know if like beautiful or what it is, but I mean the essay is very like Zen in general. I mean he ends in a like he ends both those essays on Twombly basically like talking about Zen. But he says like the essence of like any object is inextricably tied with its destruction, basically. So I don't know if it's an answer to what you were saying, Brian, but I feel that like yeah, like the Virgil scribbling without the like erasure, without the like whiteout or whatever it is, like the painting over whatever would feel to me sort of like the parody version that Nathan is talking about. It's like somehow he manages. I feel like that's the feeling, at least I get in front of the Twombly painting, is like somehow he's gotten to the essence of something in a very uh, non-intuitive way or something, or in a way that is like, you know, like his painting, you look at one of the canvases and you just see like, I tend to dislike painting where this is just purely personal preference, like purely personal. This is not a value judgment at all, but I tend to dislike paintings where I can sort of see that the marks are a result of some sort of process that is like repeatable or that like I can imagine what it was. And I feel like when I stand in front of a Twombly, I'm just like, I have no idea. Like, there's no way these marks could be the result of any kind of like process or repeatable action. And yet they all seem like perfectly sort of in relationship to one another or placed or something like that. I don't know.
I like this idea a lot of you know, and my reference point is oftentimes just Immanuel Kant when he talks about how we like works of art that seem to us as if they're nature, kind of, right? So like
Mm.
I don't want to see the hand in it necessarily, even though you could argue like from an outsider's perspective that Cy Twombly is like a totally, you know, you could say there's kind of a rudimentary or naive quality of it. But I think I'm thinking more and more that, you know, there is a kind of oddly like philosophical weight to his painting, and it makes a lot of sense that scholars are kind of like, you know, reading critically his work uh because it's not theoretical, right? Like it's not, it doesn't really feel abstract. It feels incredibly concrete. I mean, just even the anecdotal evidence of having to be in front of it and having these like totally uh I don't know, inexpressible experiences, and that's therefore the thing that makes it have some kind of philosophical value, you know. And we mentioned this, you know, this like this dumb kind of, oh, well, my kid could do that or whatever. And obviously, like a child wouldn't, you know, be able to make what Cy Twombly is doing necessarily, right? A child could scribble, but it kind of reminded me of there's a moment in Hegel's Aesthetics or like the introductory lecture where he talks about, and Kant kind of says the same thing too, but this kind of misunderstanding that art is about like artistic skill, which obviously it's not. Like we can kind of all agree that it's not about that, but he uses this incredible anecdote of a man throwing lentils through a small opening, and he says that like, you know, we reward him by saying great job and we just give him more lentils to throw, right? So like the point of artistic skill is just this kind of like self-referential thing, whereas something that's rigorous that has that skill but doesn't maybe need to display it in the same way is going to get at, I think, Luke, what you're talking about, this thing where like I don't know how that happened actually, right? Like it kind of covers up its hand or something, or that's actually a good maybe analogy for like writing Virgil with one hand and like kind of erasing it with the other one.
I'll jump in here with two thoughts and maybe triangulate these last two comments. Very quickly. First, I do want to say if we add Schwenger, Peter Schwenger, the scholar, right, Brian, who has a book on asemic writing that discusses Cy Twombly, that's writing that doesn't mean anything, writing that looks like writing, or that's a mimesis of writing but actually doesn't communicate. Um, if we add his own story about crying in front of Twombly, I think three makes a pattern, and that means that we could definitely start a meme of boys crying in front of Cy Twombly.
Oh, I actually have two more stories, but they involve women.
Boys crying is I think funnier, even if it's maybe strictly speaking less true. The other thing is just I wanted to highlight two, maybe get into my actual comment with two more highlights from Roland Barthes. Because in a way, I think that his essay captures what you're both saying. I mean, this idea of like making art that feels like nature, and maybe that actually goes back to the sense that I started with, that like you can like feel the Mediterranean coast and sunlight, in his canvases. Um, I mean, maybe Bart actually says this and I'm just forgetting, but the paradox of Twombly is that he gestures towards tradition and sort of reactivates tradition, tradition of learning, right, of culture and letters, that is like a tradition of artifice, and makes it feel like nature in the way that, I don't know, like a ruin on Sicily feels like nature. If anyone has been to the Mediterranean and seen like some ruins, it feels like it's like it's like not even culture anymore. It's like just part of the landscape. Um, and Brian, your point about a child scribbling, like, yeah, that's exactly it. Like one could say that a child scribbling is nature and not culture, you know? If it's done without intention and done purely in a spirit of like surprise and experimentation and just play. And there's something really powerful in that, like to especially when it's something that's clearly produced with such rigor and such intentionality, if not on the level of like the line, on the level of the process. That again, like Twombly is such an Apollonian artist. Like he's an artist of, in my mind, like immense, imposing craft, but what he creates is something that feels like it wasn't crafted, but
Mm.
just sort of exists as a concrete thing. Brian, I think you're totally right. Like I think again, as a naive viewer of art, or naive art enjoyer, as it were, like Twombly Twombly is not abstract. Twombly is concrete. And so I wanted to just mention these two other points in the Bart essay that really resonated. One of them is Bart says that Twombly rediscovers or like activates the sheer surprise and joy of coloring. So he says in Works on Paper, the first essay that we read, that when the sort of the magic of coloring that like a child knows, but maybe an adult forgets, is that when just because like when do we ever take a colored pencil and put it on paper? Is that you know that you're coloring with blue, but you don't know until the colored pencil hits the paper, hits the white space, what kind of blue it's really going to be.
Mm.
You actually have no idea. You can't even like conceive of what that color is going to be until it's until it's in front of you, until it's actually concrete and real. Um, and then he says something similar in the second essay about throwing. He says this is like his, like his metaphysics of a pair of pants. He has a metaphysics of throwing a ball. And he says, quote, by throwing, I know what I am doing, but I do not know what I am producing. Which I thought was an incredible line. Like, isn't that so true? It's like I know what I'm doing. There's intentionality to the throw. There's a process, right? Maybe even a technique to the throw. But I really don't know the result, you know? And it's a kind of gesture of pure chance, or maybe even like pure nature, even though it's produced by a skilled action, or an intentional action. Um, Sorry, that was just kind of a lot of random thought. But I do feel maybe like the principle of connection here is the sense of maybe either an underlying sense of nature rather than artifice, or a transcendent, like acquired degree of naturalness above the fundamental artifice that is these canvases, which are of course just like pigment or scratching or pencil or crayon or whatever medium he's using on industrially produced art paper.
I feel like I want to read you this quote based on what you said, Nathan, because I also think it maybe connects a couple of these thoughts. I have this little book of like reproductions of Twombly paintings with these quotes that are hilarious because I think they're just like kind of extracted, completely abstracted from like larger conversations and are often like completely like inscrutable and gnomic. And often just like one is just like I've always loved boats. Like that's one of the quotes is he's just saying I've always loved boats, or like I like to sit and look at the ocean. But then there will also be ones where it just totally like he's saying nothing in a way. It's weird. Like, but this one I do think is interesting because he's talking about color, and he says something I think that's surprising to me coming from him. He says, "I'm not too sensitive to color, not really. I don't use it with any nuance that I know of. It's the object, the form of the thing is more interesting to me than color," which I feel like a lot of people would sort of balk at that, like after looking at one of his paintings. But I do, especially after reading the Jacobus book or parts of the Jacobus book that we were looking at, which is about his relationship to poetry. It's like I can't even really see him as an abstract. And not even I don't even see him as an abstract painter. Like I see him as like a narrative painter. Like so many of the paintings seem to be born so starkly out of some sort of poetic or narratological like impetus, which I mean he says himself, like sometimes I even like to have a title to give myself a sense of the way something should go. Jacobus, is it Jacobus? I'm now yeah. I mean goes so far as to say that he would often solve, or he could solve formal problems in his paintings through recourse to like poetry, which I think is like I'm skeptical, but like Twombly kind of says it himself as well at various points. He talks about how he, in another lifetime, he wish he could have been Poussin, that he loves landscape, that he thinks of himself in some ways as a kind of landscape painter. Um, which is weird because he is also the epitome, as we've been saying, of the my child could do that, or as Rogan said, I could do that. He couldn't even work himself up to say. I guess he doesn't have kids. I don't know. He said I could do that. He's sort of the epitome of the my child could do that abstract art. But I think he's like I don't know. To me, yeah, he's deeply narrative. Like his paintings are deeply like subject based. Um, and there's another quote in here from him where he says like my lines are childlike but not childish. And he said it's actually something really difficult to do. And he says something like I don't know, like you have to project yourself mentally into the child to be able to do it. But it also made me think about how that's something I know we've talked about, Nathan, saying what we really like about like David Lynch, for instance, is that like the vision is like deeply childlike. It's a deeply childlike view of the world without being childish.
I think in this context, like maybe the secret sauce of Twombly's work that we haven't touched on is the fact this is something Roland Barthes makes a big deal out of, the fact that he has a very light touch, you
Mm.
know. So when he's coloring, he colors so lightly, um, almost diaphanously, or like, yeah, like it makes sense. Your quote that he doesn't care about color does track, even though the color is a big part of what draws me to Twombly's work. I was going to say earlier, like part of why I feel that I can sense or I imagine or fantasize that I can sense the Mediterranean coast is the way that he uses natural colors. You know, like imagine
Mm.
Twombly, but he used like neon orange, neon blue, and like neon green or something. It would just be a totally different effect. Um, that there's something fundamentally natural or organic or even like landscape light in his palette, but also the fact that the palette is so lightly applied, you know,
Mm.
that a blue will be like barely there or a line will be like barely there. That does feel like something that differentiates it from a child's scribbles. Like I think like like when a kid uses blue, they're all in on the blue, you know? And Twombly does have this effect of like turning his back to the blue or something, or using it without really using it, or rendering it, denaturalizing it, you know,
Mm.
not through intensity, but through the opposite of intensity, through like bringing it close to erasure. And that maybe that's where the erasing marks on his textual pieces or his names also factor in, and that like yes, it creates this negation of the line, you know, so the line producing the word or the sign is no longer this totally self contained, right, monadic thing, but becomes dispersed and disintegrated. And I want to say almost becomes atmospheric. Like
Mm.
the words, you know, by erasing the word just purely visually, it generates a kind of halo, like a kind of fog,
Mm.
you know, that is a totally strange effect, you know, when it's objectified into an aspect of a canvas, even though we see it or we remember it from when we were kids. We don't, few of us write anymore, I would think, with pencil. And then erase it. But like you remember when you were a kid and you had to write in school and you would erase something and it wouldn't quite erase and you would have this big splotchy section of your paper and that was this like this ugly flaw of your handwriting exercise. But actually it is a visual effect, you know, it's an interesting visual effect.
Mm.
And because it erodes the boundaries of the line or the stroke, it does render it again like natural. It renders it something more like air than like a construction. Um, but it also produces a kind of airiness or lightness in itself, and that it just lightens the pigment or the color. And again, disperses it or maybe diffuses is a better word. Like I think diffusion
Mm.
in the sense that a perfume can be diffused or like a gas
Mm.
can be diffused is a useful word. Like there's something vaporous about a lot of Twombly. And I would say going back to 50 Days at Ilium, I
Yeah, I
had
was gonna ask you, what about Shield of Achilles? Because Shield of Achilles is so, what makes it so powerful is it actually is like, maybe it's just offset, but it is so fiercely sort of dug into the canvas.
exactly. Yeah, I was so this isn't like a general rule of Twombly and my two it's funny because my two favorite canvases in 50 Days at Ilium are Shades of Eternal Night and Shield of Achilles. And
Oh yeah, Shades of Eternal Night is incredible. Like
the Shades
the diaphanous, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Shades of Eternal Night is right there in the title. I actually forget like if it's a reference to a particular part of the Iliad or if it's just like a vibe, but it nails the vibe. Like it's this diaphanous blue and gray that are like these wisps and the wisp like kind of there's like this cloud motif that appears or like it's so abstract or you just have no idea what it is, you know, but this shape that looks almost like a little cloud, you know, that appears throughout these canvases, but here they're rendered with such incredible lightness and diffusion that you can feel like the cool night air. Like this is probably again like a vulgar way of appreciating Twombly, but like there's something just so cool temperature wise and gaseous, you know, about that canvas that it's just incredibly sensuously immediate and powerful. And that's contrasted with the Shield of Achilles, which is both like, as you say, yeah, dug into the canvas, like really, really strong and layered. Um, like, I mean, again, this is I don't know art that well, but almost like a Rothko or something. Like just like it's like textured and the color is so intense, it's luminous in a different way, in that it just feels like it's actually glowing. Um, And I'll say as an aside, to gesture towards like our normal content on this podcast, that I think part of what drew me to Shield of Achilles when I was in college, the first time I encountered it, was precisely that it looks almost like a video game object. It's like an orb of pure energy. And for those who know the Iliad, like when like the shield of Achilles is like the ultimate equipment. Like he gets like the best gear basically in video game terms. And there's like this long description of all the cool stuff on his gear on the shield. It's the ultimate shield. It's like the prize weapon that you have to like grind or do side quests or whatever to get. Um, and this depiction or whatever it is, this reference, this communication of this ultimate not weapon, but ultimate piece of right of tech or equipment feels like this, yeah, like this pure magic orb of power, in again to sort of gesture towards video game iconography. It actually reminds me for listeners who, one game, Luke, that we talk about a lot is the video game Dark Souls. It's in the same series
Mm.
as Bloodborne. And in Dark Souls, there are these enemies called Dark Wraiths, which are like these fallen spirit knights, and they have this move where they like summon like an orb of like pure energy. I actually think sometimes they can use it. They use that as a shield as well to block your attacks. And the Shield of Achilles kind of looks like that, um, but colored in. So, so yeah, like it's a good counterexample. I think for me, like moments like the Shield of Achilles, or there's one, I think it's
You know what I
not.
just realized? I
Oh, go
wasn't
ahead.
thinking of Shield of Achilles. I was thinking of the fire that consumes all
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
before, which is even more intense, I guess you could
Yes.
say, or even more like, yeah, I don't even know what the word is.
I mean, yeah, it's like it's the most intense red I've ever seen on a canvas, you know.
Yeah.
And that too, I think um uh that canvas and Shield of Achilles are powerful precisely because for me, precisely because he has such a light touch everywhere else. You know,
Mm.
it's like when he commits fully to a color or right or to a texture or even or something, it it seems so much more significant. And of course, like the fire that consumes all in its path, if that's what it's called, I think is a kind of gesture. I keep wanting to say representation, but they're not representational, there's something else. Is
Mm.
a communication of, I think, when Achilles goes like and wrecks house, right? And massacres all of the Trojans. And so that too feels like a kind of pure rage and power, that is perfectly, again, I keep saying the word communicated because I can't think of anything else, communicated by just the
Yeah.
sheer visual aspect of that canvas.
I do feel like there's like later in his career, especially, like I was just in Munich where there's a museum in Munich, the Brandhorst, where they have a collection of these huge rose paintings. Um, that there I do think his colors can like especially towards later in his career could almost get like a little garish.
Hmm.
Like um I think it's a little more subtle in the maybe the middle period and like in a lot of the Mediterranean paintings, but when I read that quote from him about color, I feel that what he's saying is that he doesn't fetishize like color. And that's actually a feeling I get. I think that's something very admirable about him as an artist is I don't really get the impression that he fetishizes anything about the paintings, including the objects and the materials, which, as Bart says, I think rightly, like the paintings are all about the materials, like about making the materials sort of visible as materials, but they're so unfetishized. And it's the same thing with his relationship to like poetry, where it's like I like some of my favorite details in the Jacobus book is just that he would go like he would well one that he would paint with an open book of poetry, which I think is hilarious. That like these poetry books had paint in them because he would be like reading them while painting, but also that he would edit the poems. Like not just like in what he chose to transcribe like into the canvas, but like in the book, he would like cross out phrases, like change words, like it's just like zero fetishization of the like poetic material itself. And I think for him, it was just that, like I feel like I've heard him say this, like for him, the poetry was just kind of like another texture or material to use in the canvases. And what was important to him was like how he could use them, not like that he quotes Catullus like accurately, but just that it was sort of there and available to be, yeah, I don't know if the right word is like transcribed or whatever, but to be edited and kind of molded and just like inscribed onto the canvases.
If I can, yeah, if I can just jump, it's like because I feel like thinking back a little bit to the that my child could do this. I think this addresses that, but also, what you've both been talking about since then. So uh, I feel like there's an important, in addition to poetry, another important like literary cross medium parallel, I guess, which is that, when I think of Beckett and particularly Beckett's fiction, like his novels and his short fiction. Uh, I think it's a critical commonplace now to say that Beckett, in a certain way, Beckett is concerned with how to say nothing, right? Or how to make language just speak, but without saying something. And obviously the paradox is that his characters, both his narrator or his narrative voice, but also the characters seem to be afflicted by this endless chattering that is aimed at saying nothing but can't stop, right? Because you can't just stop saying to say nothing. You have to keep saying, and in that saying is the nothing. Um, but you can't, the thing I'm thinking of is that like a child babbles and says nothing in order to try to say something. But, Beckett, or maybe we could say Twombly, uh, realizes that they have to say or do something, but is aiming at this nothingness, right? Or is aiming at this silence, right? So I'm almost thinking now of Twombly as like a kind of Beckett. And so if he's not fetishizing, as you put it, Luke, the object, whether that's just like a patch of color or an actual word or whatever it might be, then it's the object maybe is there in order to create an atmosphere, right? I mean, Schwenger says in his book that this is a quote from his book. He says, "Atmosphere is in itself a nameless thing, but to the degree that it can be represented at all, it is represented in Twombly's work by whiteness." And so, obviously, Twombly didn't just paint a bunch of white canvases, which would be one version of solving this problem, right? Instead, he has canvases that are populated by plenty of stuff, but that stuff is not really the point. And so, I wonder, like, thinking about paintings as having a narrative, which I find is like a fascinating idea. I wonder if it's then some kind of narrative without a subject or without a topic, right? Like if there's a narrative at all, or if there's something happening at all, it's like an activation of this atmosphere. And this is where, Bart also says, like, he talks about how they feel like the Mediterranean, but he also specifically says that, what is it he says? Twombly's canvases are big Mediterranean rooms, warm and luminous with their elements lost in them, rooms the mind seeks to populate. So like the canvases are, populated in a way by these objects or subjects or whatever we want to call them, but those things are already kind of like provisional because they're only there in order to be like popping out against the atmosphere and thus constituting the atmosphere at the same time. If the atmosphere is like the blank whiteness, of the canvas.
Yeah, I want to jump in and speak about Beckett in relation to Luke's point about non-fetish sort of not fetishizing uh the material, or in this case like the cultural tradition that's being gestured towards. Because it reminds me of something that the literary scholar Leo Bersani says in, well, this is like top five literary essay of all time for me. This essay called Against Ulysses, i.e. against my favorite book. But um it's a critique of Joyce's Ulysses, and one thing that he says is that Joyce gestures towards culture, right, toward the Homeric archetype and myth in a way that's, if not aspirational, like pretentious and snobby. Um, in that he's saying, "Oh, look what I'm doing. Look how cultured I am," or Bressani's term is redeeming, right? Redeeming literature or redeeming culture by containing it in this work, like it's sort of an ark, a Noah's Ark of Western culture. Whereas for Beckett, like Latin quotations from philosophy or from school are, for in Bersani's words, the occasion for a kind of psychotic raving. That is like Beckett's characters exist in this kind of post-apocalyptic world where, yeah, they remember shit from like whatever Aquinas or something, but it's just because it's like a kind of brain rot mind virus that they can't even remember right, so they're misquoting it and it's just like they're doomed to repeat it because it's just one of the things that's in their brain. And I cite that because I don't think that's what Twombly is doing. Like I don't think Twombly is treating culture, Western culture, tradition um as a ruin, or as crap, like in the way that Beckett does. Like Beckett treats it just basically
Mm.
as trash. That's how Beckett, doesn't, rejects the fetishization of classical references. Twombly reminds me much more of someone like T.S. Eliot, who, when Eliot references classical culture, it's not to me pretentious at all because it's just who he is. And he actually fucks with it too and will distort it sometimes, or will give his own spin on it. Um, it's just like that's just what's rattling around in his brain, or that's just the air that he breathes. And for Twombly, I get the sense, not knowing anything about him or knowing very little, and again, knowing little about how these canvases were made and their context. Like when Twombly's referencing Virgil, I just get the sense he's doing it because that's the air he's breathing. It's not because he has some kind of positive relationship towards Virgil, right? Or wants to suggest um his own connection to the tradition, to Virgilian tradition, or to say like, in cruder terms, like, look how well read I am. Um, Maybe this is all a way of saying that his attitude towards the classical references that appear in his works is like deeply neutral. Like it's
Mm.
neither rejection, as in Beckett, or sort of like a trashing, or a treating as trash, as in Beckett, nor is it aspirational or heroicizing or cherishing, like in Bersani's reading of Joyce, but it's something just ambient,
Well,
like it's
that's
just there.
childlike also. I
Yeah.
feel like a kid is gets obsessed with something and talks your ear off about it, but not because, I mean, presumably not because they think it makes them look cool or smart or anything like that.
Yeah, like my nephew is obsessed with classical music. Like he's 3.5, or I guess oh God, I'm like the on mic, I'm forgetting his age. But we were riding in the car on Thanksgiving, and he turned to me and asked me who wrote the Blue Danube Waltz. And he can like barely like form a sentence, but that's, obviously not because he wants to be cool or is a snob. Like it's just literally what he breathes. Like he just breathes classical music for whatever reason. That's just like that's his shit. Um and yeah, it's a really good comparison. That's totally right. Like Twombly is like a kid who just ingested a lot of Virgil and Homer, like just ambiently, or because he liked it or something, or just because it was there, because it was like ready to hand, because it was around, you
I
know?
think that's what he was reading. Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing with like it's the same thing as like, well, why does this painting look like this? Well, because these were the like pencils and the like crayon and the paint that I had like at the moment. I do feel like with Twombly, the references are also like what it means when Twombly cites like Virgil or Catullus or whatever. Uh, Dickinson even. I mean, like, what it means is like I had this book, like,
Mhm.
and I
Mhm.
was looking at it, like, or even in the case as we know from the Jacobus, like I was holding, like I had this book in my hand, like when I was painting, and it's not like I went to I feel like there's kind of a reciprocal relationship between those things for Twombly, where it's like sometimes the poetry was meant to like give, as he puts it, like a feeling for the way like a painting should go. But at other times, it was literally like the painting was already going, and I guess he thought like he needed the poetry as like a formal solution. Like he claimed there's this giant painting in the Menil, which I think um, uh, uh, Jacobus. Why does that sound so weird to me when I'm saying that? That's her name? I think it's Mary Jacobus that she talks about, or it's like very important in her book because it's this giant painting in the Menil called "Say Goodbye, Catullus, to the Shores of Asia Minor," and it's an important example both because Twombly claimed that that title how would you even say that that title led him out of a like formal trap he was in with the painting, like he couldn't finish it, and somehow that title like unleashed it or like allowed him to finish it. But it's also exemplary because he changed the line. Like the line in Catullus is not "Say goodbye, Catullus, to the shores of Asia Minor." It was like something actually I think like less poetic than the shores of Asia Minor, and he just changed it. So I think for Jacobus, that was sort of like a doubly important example because it's both showed how like the poetry itself could exert an influence on him formally, but also how he would just change it if he wanted to.
I love the idea too of like these were just the things that I had, or these were just the things that were around. It makes me think of to make a brief connection to an earlier conversation, Brian, about Bennett Sims. Like it's almost like Twombly's art in this sense is not a treatise or an essay, and not even a letter, but a postcard. You know, like a postcard of a certain ambient situation, which would
Mm,
include like the light, the air, the room, and the books that you have like to hand.
mm,
Yeah, in a way, it's, I mean, it's like an incredibly, now that you put it that way, right? That's like an incredibly fundamental way to think about what, in a certain light, just what it is to make any kind of art at all, right? To like just literally to like capture a moment, And I think, I mean, I'm definitely far from an art scholar or anything like that. But Twombly certainly stands out among all of, anyone who would seem to be a contemporary in my mind, at least, right? Like I think or maybe what I would say is that his poetics or whatever it is that he's trying to do is much more, I don't want to say legible because that makes it sound like it's like hitting you over the head with it, but it's easier to tell that he's not simply working in a style, I guess is what I would say. Like it's easy for me to look at his work, even in the kind of bastardized version of looking at it on a computer screen, and see that there's a lot going on here that's like complex in its simplicity or something, right? He's trying to get at something that's like an experiential thing rather than like it doesn't really seem to be about art in a way. Like it doesn't seem to be commenting or be like theoretical about art. And that's actually then I think the way that it is like a good instance to think theoretically about it because it's doing something that's like totally real life. And I wonder maybe then if that's like why if it's not only because his works are not done justice by reproduction that it's in front of them that you have like this kind of experience, but maybe there's just maybe a better or a greater continuity with just everyday life to his works, as odd as that might sound, because they're totally like non-representational, because I think about this a lot. I mean, this is something I've written about, but this idea of, we go to the museum to see great works of art, and art is supposed to give us a certain experience. And um, I would be hard pressed to like recall a particular time that I saw a certain painting and actually had, unintentionally or involuntarily really had a kind of experience like that. I'm sure it's happened, but it seems to be more rare. Like it kind of seems to be an exception that would happen because partly because museums are so overwhelming with how much they contain and how incongruous it already is, even if it was only one painting, to be walking into a room and I know I'm going to go look at that painting and like how am I going to have really an experience if I kind of know that I'm going to go in there and intentionally go look at it. Um, but something like Twombly's work feels in a way, yeah, like a little more natural, even to go back to that idea of like because I think at a certain point with art at least what is natural needs to be contextual, right? Like Nathan, almost like how we're talking about horror, like what is really horrifying needs to be contextual. It's not just going to be some kind of objective thing. It's actually going to be the thing, almost like a punctum, as Bart would say, something that sticks out amid the context that maybe doesn't have anything to do with the subject or something. And so, like, it's going to be hard for me, even if I think that, Rembrandt is incredibly beautiful, it might be in certain moods or whatever, kind of difficult to have a real experience with it because I'm not in that time period and that kind of costume doesn't make any sense to me, for example. Whereas there's something, yeah, maybe more because more naive, because it doesn't fetishize the object, because it, even though it's incredibly singular and you could tell what is a Twombly versus something else, it also doesn't really feel stylized. Like it feels like the
Mm.
childlikeness of it feels a lot more again studied and intentional, but also like it's trying to gesture outside of any particular grouping or something like that, right? Like he's trying to escape or not be bound to um, an era or movement within art.
Yeah, there's another. I thought I would read another one of these kind of funny quotes that are in this book. This one is like much more straightforward, but I do think it also speaks to like what Bart says about Twombly, and he just says certain things are just the moment you do them, and sometimes it's the message. You know, it's a tricky thing. That's all. That's the whole quote. But I think that's exactly what Bart says in a way also about the paintings. Is just they're sort of about, yeah, there's just sort of about the instant of their creation. And from what I know about his process, he was very um like I would never want to try. I mean, I think Bart also has a quote that I couldn't find in one of these essays, but I know I read somewhere where he says like the thing with the Twombly painting is like it makes you want to paint like Twombly, or it like makes you want to like write like Twombly, but it's like a huge mistake. And I always like I also feel that that's true. Like you asked me at the very beginning, Nathan, I feel like I would actively like resist like trying to paint like Twombly, despite my like deep admiration and appreciation. And you know, yeah, I don't know. I feel that he says like if you try to imitate Twombly's line, like it's not gonna look like his and it's not gonna look like yours and it's gonna be like dead. But he claims he would just sit for like 2, 3 hours, like maybe reading, maybe just looking out a window, maybe thinking about what he was about to do. And then he would just do it in like it seemed like sometimes they could come to he said like they could come together in like minutes, like a whole painting would just be done. But that he would spend a lot of time just kind of sitting and doing nothing or like looking at it, or maybe that's also like when he would be like reading poems or whatever. And then there's really just sort of about that moment, which I feel like Bart also talks about this, right? It's just like there's no going, those marks are, there's no going back sort of on them. Like they just sort of are what they are in the instant without possibility for like correction or anything like that. I mean, you can paint over them, you can like do it again, you can white it out, whatever, but um it's almost like important that they're done in that way, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I love I think there's something interesting here about windows, that is being surfaced. Like you mentioned that he would read and sit by a window. And again, it's like that's the ambiance or the atmosphere of these paintings is like,
Mm,
as Bart said, like a Mediterranean room where the windows are like, are thrown, or I imagine, maybe I'm just adding that, but I imagine it as windows are thrown wide. And when I think of a Mediterranean room, I do think of this kind of like perfect balance between inside and outside, that um the classical like a Mediterranean space is permeable because the air is so temperate and
mm,
light, and so you can have this kind of interpenetration of inside and outside that is comfortable, you know? Um,
mm.
And it makes me think of Brian, like your work on aesthetic experience, Luke, like Brian's book is Brian, if I can sort of give a shitty whatever synopsis of it. Like Brian writes about how when we think of aesthetic experience of a work of art, we're also thinking of literally the experience of that work of art, like where we are, the conditions of the room, the temperature, the light.
Mm.
And this just making me realize now that when I think of your theory or your account of aesthetic experience, Brian, like I think of it as always in relation to windows, such that I want to say like the deciding factor of like one's own experience with literature is like the history of the windows you were near when you were reading or something. That like that tells you so much, it activates so much. Like I can think of the windows that I sat near while reading particular works, you know,
Mm.
and that colors my impression of them and even like the enjoyment of them, you know, or my memory of the enjoyment of them. Um, I'm not sure exactly where I'm going with this, but just that. Yeah, I want to think more about it. Like Twombly is like a painting of like or like what's the term here? It's like fenestral painting or something.
Well, I feel like oddly, because I've never, I guess, written about art, but I think that Twombly oddly kind of contains the whatever associative bundle of concepts that you're kind of identifying here, right? Because there's atmosphere, there's this window thing, which I totally, especially once I read that quote from the Bart essay, right, about there being these are rooms or something, and if you're surrounded by these paintings on all sides, then maybe being in that in the room brings you into another room where maybe these are windows or something like that. And it strikes me as kind of like a weird, ostensibly much warmer version of the Proust passage that I always talk about, where there's the window, the weather outside, and that's the thing that just kind of by chance, both iteratively, but also singularly gives the narrator this kind of unspeakable experience just simply because of the weather. And there's a complete almost like disappearance of the object and even maybe the subject. There's no it's not any one thing that makes it happen. Um, but I'm also interested in, chance and it seems to me that like Luke, what you keep bringing up about the sort of irrecoverability irrevocability and maybe like um what would the word be? Like provisional nature of the paintings. Like he's making the work just because it's what he has on hand, Like seems like a way that the element of chance is introduced as well, like a kind of specifically a kind of like illegible element of chance because there's no way we would know that, It's not like he's painting, it's not like he's telling us that he made all these paintings by rolling dice or anything like that, or it's like it's not a painting of a roulette wheel, but clearly if he's making these paintings without without objects in a way, right? Like objects are just kind of there and he uses them to make the paintings, like whether that's again color or text or reference even. They seem to be deliberately chosen, but chosen in a way yeah, it can't be erased. Like there's a trace to them. And so even when he's erasing the Virgil, there's like it's like when you have those, I remember the pencils that had like the really hard erasers. Those were the ones that would mess up when you would try to erase it. And it kind of feels like even if you try to erase it, it's going to just make more of a smudge and it will just kind of infect whatever it is until it becomes this kind of weird atmosphere, right? It's no longer just additive or subtractive. It's kind of generative or whatever in a way that really involves chance and how the atmosphere kind of actually looks on the painting.
Yeah, and I think also the it's not just the act of erasure, but just like accretion. Like um, the I think I wouldn't say a lot of his paintings have like layers necessarily, like literally. Like it's not like he's a painter who's building up a lot of like layers of painting, but I do think it's important that they look like maybe even that they've like multiple hands have been like into them
Mm.
over time, maybe even like at different moments in time or like different even like eras or something. which I think is partially comes from his interest in the classical world and just the accretion of just kind of layers and layers of like cultural significance that, kind of make up the totality of what we think of as like quote unquote Virgil or whatever. It's not just Virgil or the Aeneid or the Georgics or whatever. It's like all the like layers and layers and layers of a creative like meaning that gets sort of heaped onto it and erased and like written over or whatever. I mean, people talk a lot about graffiti um, with Twombly, and I mean, he addresses it himself, and I think Bart talks about it as well, right? But like, I mean, he's very clear that like there's something graffiti like about his like scrawl, but that it's not. I forget what he says. It's like it doesn't come from a place of like protest. I think that's what he said. He says he's like most of the time graffiti is like protest, but like what I'm doing is not protest. It's more like I don't know. It's like vulgar Latin or something, like on a wall of a like in Pompeii or something like that. Like it's about meaning that's sort of disassociated from like any type of like context, but at the same time sort of builds up its own sort of like atmosphere and sense of like feeling or meaning just from being there. I don't know. I don't think what I just said makes any sense, but that's how I feel when I look at them.
No, that actually makes total sense because there's a temporality to graffiti, and I think that Twombly Twombly's work looks like graffiti sometimes, but it has a totally different temporality. Just simply in that, for instance, like scrawling something and then smudging it is different from is not that I've, again as the resident normie on this podcast, not that I know anything really about graffiti, but I would think
we
that
all we all used to tag.
yeah, scrawling, I mean, like doing a piece of graffiti art and then like you wouldn't then erase it or smudge it, right? Like that. Twombly is more like a wall that's been graffitied and then somebody tried to clean up the graffiti but couldn't quite do it, you know?
Exactly, yeah.
Which
And then it
which
gets graffitied again.
exactly. And that's so it's not this kind of instantaneity and like singular intention or gesture, but it's a kind of thickness of multiple intentions and multiple gestures or something, and multiple times and multiple moments, as you were saying, Luke.
I wonder if this is like a place where Nathan, our shared interest in like wonder can also come into because thinking about again this kind of like unruly like studied and rigorous yet unruly way of painting, it's not like I mean, I wonder, I guess you could look at his journals and see like how he thought about his process and how he determined when a canvas was done, but I do think that um the terminus or like the danger with this kind of style would be too much, like either too painting too much or adding too much color or effacing it or erasing it too much. And I wonder like when that's another way in which the process is kind of illegible or unavailable to us. As Luke, you kind of said earlier, like we don't really know how these were made, and even like conceptually how they were made, like how he decided that, oh, okay, I'm just gonna write Virgil and like smudge it this much so we can still read it, but it's like it feels like it's being erased in real time or something like that. But easily he could have, smudged it a little bit less or a little bit more or something like that. And so there's something that's both, on the one hand, feels arbitrary, like we were aware that it's, the painting is that way because that's the way he painted it, just like the materials he used are the ones he used because they're the ones that he had on hand. Like the same is true of the process. And yet, obviously, these things are in a museum and they are like named and they have that stamp of like, it was created in this year. So it's like a finished work of art or something. And so it has a kind of necessity as well. So we're kind of like, I don't know, oscillating between that, which is another thing that I find really fascinating about this kind of art, whether it's painting or, music, like improvised music, you still have like classic records of improvised music, which was accidental and probably, largely up to chance. Yet it's like recorded forever in a medium that you can listen to, and it's become, if not canonized, at least received in a certain format. Same thing could be true of Beckett. Like how would you notice if you read two different drafts of Malloy, and like one word was changed, you probably wouldn't be able to tell. And yet there's still going to be a definitive version. So yeah, that to me feels like an opening onto like wonder, right? This is like how another way that these paintings can be kind of thought about endlessly or kind of considered in a maybe a more abstract way, but one that I find is still pretty compelling.
I was gonna say sorry to keep coming back to these like quotations, but I find them very like funny and often illuminating in like sort of irrational ways. But like another one of these quotations, he says like for him painting, he says for him painting is more like having an experience than making a picture. So he says it's more like I'm having an experience than making a picture. So I've never had anyone around. I never have. People are different, but I really have to be with no interference, and it takes me hours. Painting a picture is a very short thing if it goes well, but the sitting and thinking, I usually go off on stories that have nothing to do with the painting, and sometimes I sit in the opposite room to where I work. Like I have no idea what he means when he says I go off on stories that have nothing to do with the painting. Like, is he just thinking about stories? Is he, I mean, I have no, I mean, it's totally unclear. Like, I go off on stories that have nothing to do with the painting. But I was just laughing also because we were talking about like rooms and windows so much that he says sometimes I go in the opposite room to where I'm actually working, which is apparently some part of the, I guess, crucial part of the process at times for him is to be in the opposite room. I have no idea what to make of it, but I do think that like having an experience thing like resonates perfectly, like with everything we've been saying. That like, yeah, I don't know, or maybe it's also related to what like Bart says about like we want to see like the body like in the painting, and that like the problem with like technically perfect art is that like the body is like completely erased from it. And I feel like with Twombly, uh, yeah, I don't know. In a way, like there's like something with presence. Like you get a feeling of like his presence. Like I think in the making of the picture, but it doesn't have anything to do with like. Or Nathan, we were laughing about that. I forget, was it from the Jacobus book, that detail where she says like he made some of those blackboard paintings by like getting on the shoulders of his friend and like having like a long brush and like his friend like kind of carried him around on his shoulders, that they're sort of like goofing around. But like, I don't know, you get like a sort of feeling or sense of the experience that he's talking about. And it doesn't really feel like you said, Brian, like it's about art, really. Like this is a really, I guess, sentimental way of like maybe affirming what you were saying, but like I feel that there's some artists you look at or admire or whatever, and what you feel like you're learning from the experience of like being in the presence of their painting is something about how to look at art or how to look at other art. Um, but like when I look at Twombly, like, and I feel this is one of the reasons I just feel a deep connection to the paintings is I feel that they changed the way I look at like the world. Like I don't feel like they changed the way I look at art at all. I feel like they changed the way I look at like walls, like piles of shit in the street. Like I don't know, like um somehow it had like the opposite effect on me. Like it hasn't really changed at all the way I like think about art or look at art, but and I don't think there could be anything for me. There's like nothing more like to me that's much more powerful than like sort of shaping the way I see like art or art history or whatever it is.
I think that's really beautiful and tracks perfectly with that line, that you just read, Luke, about, an experience rather than making a painting. It all seems of accord, and maybe seems like a good place to wrap here, as because as you pointed out, Luke, it does kind of ground, I think, this whole discussion, this notion of an experience rather than a painting. Um, so yeah, I mean, this was like honestly really generative, and thanks so much for coming on, and and sharing your thoughts on Twombly and educating us on Twombly.
Speaking of experience, yeah, what an experience being on my first podcast ever. You know, we didn't get to the two female I mean, maybe we want to leave it at boys crying in front of Twombly, but we didn't even get to the other sort of ecstatic experiences that I know of with Twombly paintings. One of which involves like a security guard finding a woman dancing naked in front of a bunch of them at the Menil in Houston. And another one, there was like a famous case with a woman who was actually an artist kissing one of the canvases at an exhibit in Paris and like staining the canvas with lipstick. And they charged her and like fined her a bunch of money. And in court, she was like, it was like purely spontaneous and like out of love that I like did this. They couldn't get the lipstick out, first of all. They tried like a million things. Then they fined her. They ordered her to pay one symbolic euro to Twombly himself for the damages. And the litigator for the prosecution said, like, that's not my version of love. Like, my version of love requires the consent of both parties. So that was her retort to the woman when she said, like, she had done it purely, like, out of, like, love and, like, spontaneously.
That's amazing. That's interesting. Yeah, do you need consent to love art? Uh, is an interesting question. These are great. Yeah, those are anecdotes. Why don't we leave off here? I'll just say quickly that behind me I have the window wide open, which is something I almost never do in San Francisco because it's always so cold, even when it's hot. But we've had this spell of like incredible spring weather, even though it's February. And so I'll say going back to this image, Bart's image of Twombly's art as a room, that if you're living a Twombly canvas, or a Twombly life in Italy, and the sea breeze is just streaming in through your linen curtains or whatever, and the sunlight is just flooding the room that you're either working in or not working in. Um, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, unlike every other occasion that we evoke on this podcast, that this is the one setting, the only setting, in which you do not have to keep your magic lantern lit. Thanks, guys.